Make a start now. Welcome everyone to this PL session all about podcasting. My name is Liz. I'm one of the team members at Educators SA, and this professional learning session has come about for two reasons. Firstly, podcasting is hugely popular, and secondly, a lot of you have expressed interest in learning how to make your own podcast. We are super thrilled to have our special guest with us this evening, Dr. Adam Brown, who is a senior lecturer in digital media at Deakin University and an expert at what he does. Anyway, welcome, Adam. I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for coming along. I really appreciate the opportunity here. I'm working with a couple of different devices here, an iPad for notes, a PC with a smartphone on standby. Apologies in advance if there are any issues with the connection. So thank you, and thank you for indulging me. This is a little bit of a different setup. I'll be looking over a few different ways, so I won't be engaging with the camera, which is probably not going to capture my speaking voices as quickly and in real time as I'd hoped. So what I wanted to do here, I'm going to I've got a bit of a structure worked out, and I'm basically going to show you a bunch of screenshots, and many of them are links that I'm more than happy to provide to, which have further resources. It's really great to hear that people are interested in podcasting, and I should also say thank you again if you missed what I said before, for coming along. Thank you to Liz for organising and for allowing me to present here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my story, because I think that's a really nice, accessible way in to making you feel like Liz's introduction of me had a very big lie as part of that. I'm not an expert, but I'll come back to that a little bit later on. I'm going to talk about my very first podcast, which was back in 2016. I'm going to talk about why podcasts, why are they actually influential and important and useful, but also what for, what could we use them for in an educational context in particular, and also the how, a lot of the different elements of the how to make a podcast. And I'll try to really not go into too much specific detail, but open up some key areas that I can more than happy to take questions on any of this as we move through. So assuming I'm fairly audible there, I'll just move on to a little bit about my background. As Liz said, I lecture in digital media these days, but my education at the same uni I teach was at Deakin University. I did a Bachelor of Arts in Literature and History. I had no interest whatsoever in technology. I'm a very late adopter of said technology. I started teaching digital media in 2013, and the week before that unit, I actually bought my very first smartphone, and I assumed that all of my students would be very much ahead of me in the game. So that was really, I guess, the first moment where I started to digitize myself. I jumped on social media. I teach with videos, now podcasts. I'm even on Tik Tok making videos now as of the last 6 to 12 months, just to constantly try out different things, different ways of engaging with people. So I haven't given traditional lectures since the year 2013, and I have been doing lots of different things in the meantime. There's a bit of a summary up on the screen there, but that's basically from my main website. I don't want to go too much into detail here, because I did want to flag what's coming up on the screen now. If you're interested in kind of a bit more of that trajectory and actually really seeing how and this is the main podcast I run, how I've really kind of come to digital media from someone who, and my students still laugh at it, I'd never sent an email until my first year of university in 2001. I didn't know what emojis were until about 3 weeks after I was using them. So I really am quite a late adopter of technology, but I was very fortunate that my younger brother and I made a lot of videos. And so I've always had a keenness to make media so that I didn't have to speak to people in public presentations. And it was only about a decade after we stopped making videos in VCE to avoid doing presentations or talks in class that I started to make media as a teacher. So that's sort of where I've become a lecturer in digital media, and I became head of discipline. And at 10 years after I actually dropped out of first year media and communication studies at Deakin because I didn't like it. It didn't feel relevant. 10 years after dropping the discipline, I was then the head of the discipline. And so coming into it kind of with a fresh perspective is sort of what I've done, I guess. This podcast, Social Media Stories, is kind of my latest level up. It took me some years to get to that, to have the confidence to actually put that out on things like iTunes and Spotify and the Google Android apps, for instance. I was making podcasts, as you'll see a little bit later, on SoundCloud, and I'm going to give you some advice about potentially useful ways in which you can start off. And I think that my experience might help you. But basically, Social Media Stories is a collection of other people's stories. The first episode is my story, but even there I bring in my 2 or 3 year old niece to talk about learning. I've talked to industry practitioners, I've talked to other educators, I've talked to research colleagues, I've talked to increasingly students, just to bring their perspectives. And that's really, I guess, the main thing about my approach, is that even though and Liz called me an expert, and I remember one student last year in a seminar calling me king of the podcast, I actually am nothing of the sort. I only share that story to say that I am a complete amateur in many ways, and that's probably sometimes how I make things come across as authentic. Imperfection and learning by doing, lifelong learning, are really the two key phrases. Learning by doing, lifelong learning is what I constantly am talking about with students, and they get sick of me saying those things. And that really philosophy of learning by doing, which I didn't come up with, is really what's embedded or really driven my use of podcasts, because as you'll see, it was very amateur when I began. So I'm not an expert or a guru, but I actually get called it far too often for my own good. So that's kind of really where I wanted to kind of set the scene, because I don't want you to think I'm an expert. I'm still constantly learning. And when I began recording with my audio, and I'll come back to this later, with my smartphone, I'm talking to you on my latest smartphone, it took me 2 years before I figured out that my audio recorder on my smartphone had a high quality setting. So I don't know if it would have made much difference, but I actually didn't even go into the settings to figure out if I was really doing it as well as I could. So that's sort of where I wanted to begin there. And I don't want to talk about Social Media Stories too much, because I wanted to go back to where I started in 2016. So hopefully my audio is holding together there. What I want to do here, instead of me actually playing this, because I don't think even with good internet it comes through very well, I'm just going to open the chat, if I can find that, the best way. And I'm going to share the link to my very first podcast. With your microphones muted still, it'd be great if you can just open that up and just listen to the first 2.5 minutes, no more than that. And I'll start up again at about 5:51. And I'll just get verification from Liz that my audio is holding together in the meantime. So the link should be in the chat area. And if you can listen to the first 2.5 minutes, then I'll sort of unpack what I did there. Okay, I'll assume that's roughly 2 minutes. I just realized that the time of 5:51 would not have helped you given the time difference with South Australia. But hopefully that gave you a little bit of a sense of what I sounded like when I began podcasting. And it probably sounds good enough. I'm actually perfectly happy with the way that was. My initial plan, as you could see there, I really want to talk about serendipity here, because the idea of scripting something word for word, one, probably never really comes out as the way that you would spokalize it anyway. But you can see there that I was just using what I had available to me. I put my phone up in front of me on a magnetized kind of surface holder, and I pressed record. I went for a drive, and it was actually probably the semi-distracted nature of being able to focus on something else, like if I also walk around recording myself with my phone, which allowed me to speak in kind of a natural way. I used the sound effects from my car. I still remember in 2016 editing the music along with the sound of my ignition there, so that it sort of all kind of went together very nicely. And that probably, even though I'm using some fillers like I am now, ums and ahs, it probably sounded like I didn't actually edit throughout that podcast at all. I can promise you that I probably had a 30-minute audio file at least, maybe 40 minutes to make that 20-minute podcast, only 15 minutes of which was probably me talking, because it's got a few musical intervals. So there's a lot of editing, which actually makes my imperfect, very halting, lots of pauses, lots of fillers, my delivery sound like I'm just naturally talking with the odd and ah, which I intentionally left in. So you can kind of hear there that sounds like a pretty professional piece of work in some ways. I wouldn't record with my engine in the background anymore, but it was clear enough at the time. And basically the idea, I'd never listened to a single podcast ever before when I made that podcast. I had no idea what a podcast was. I don't even know if I really, I just called it a recording made for my teaching in digital media. I didn't even use the word podcast. And I just thought that I was doing one. This was a different, I'd already given 3 videos I'd made on YouTube for that week. And so I thought, I've got to do something different. I don't want to make another video and make them watch all the way through. And so I just did that, and I thought it was going to be once off. And I actually renamed this episode 1 because students told me, as you can see in the number of hits that's got, about 378, there would have been, I think that's 2 units worth. I used it twice, and there would have been no more than 350 to 360 students. So it pretty much got 100% attention. They really did need to listen to this one. And I often find that students listen more than once, especially international students. So even though I'd never listened to a podcast before, I'd never made one, I basically made a semi-competent one right at the beginning. And the serendipitous nature of walking around, taking notes for what I thought would be a video script, and then just saying, to hell with it, I'm going to use it in a video, sort of shows you just the creative process of media making. Sometimes just doing brings out amazing things. Planning and preparation are really important, but you also discover sometimes the best things come out in the recording and the editing process. So just being creative brings out those amazing things. I've got so many stories about that, but I won't go into them. So 2 things there. Why do I know that students actually really like this podcast? One, from the analytics, the fact that I was immensely surprised that I got many people listening after they were already asked in week 2 or whatever it was to watch 3 other videos. And if you look at this second example I'll put on the screen here, which ended up being 4 out of 5 episodes for this, it doesn't look like it's updating on my phone at the moment too quickly, but this second example here, which was assignment advice, portfolio feedback, and further advice, even though students were given audio feedback, personalized audio feedback of between 7 and 10 minutes, I found a way to actually give more advice in 25 minutes, answer common, frequently asked questions. The second way that I know podcasts work is the qualitative, because if I scroll down here, and hopefully my computer catches up with it, I did not ask for comments on this at all. They're not really questions, and I'll just leave it up there for a little while I talk to it. These comments from students who had not even used SoundCloud before as well, and they needed to make an account to actually leave these, I believe, at the time, sort of show the interest in using podcasts. So I got a bunch of feedback over that period of time, just to say thank you, really glad that I turned in, loved hearing how creativity can be so broad and individual. I can't put this in a document that would be as interesting to read, but I'll come back to that shortly. Thanks for the helpful post and so on. So you can kind of see just from the quantity of unsolicited feedback that podcasts were a real novelty. And that's what leads me on to the next section here, why podcasts? Because I think that it's kind of obvious in some ways, and I don't like to use the word novelty, but they still do have a lot of novelty. There's a lot of people, teachers out there who make recordings, audio and video and so on, but podcasts, you've got a very broad definition, but students won't think of them as that unless they're made as a podcast. So the things that I want to go through here, why might you want a podcast, mostly from an audience perspective, which it always should be: novelty, convenience, affect, immersion. The 3 C's that I actually will come back to, that's more about what they have for you. And I've also added community, so I'll come back to that too. And firstly, novelty. The very fact that, this is my first example of a podcast. I think there's still novelty there, by all means. I might have just lost my, I will wait for that. That will come up on the screen again. Can I still be heard there, Liz, just to double check?
Yes, you sure can.
Great. Thanks. So it's just buffering again. I'll share the screen. So there we are. So the novelty of podcasts is really clear there. They're perceived as different to lecture recordings because they are different. They are different than just listening to someone in a lecture theatre, often not very effective kind of audio quality as well. Convenience. This is probably the thing that most pops up, even with videos. Convenience of being able to watch it in small chunks or listen in small chunks when you want, sort of learn as you go. That's a really big thing. But I noticed leading up to that, even at that time, my tutors, the people teaching with and for me, were telling me that they were just listening to my YouTube videos if they didn't need to see what was on the screen. And I, for example, was making a lot of videos that had conversations in them. I didn't always use a lot of overlay footage. Every year I've kind of had to make videos more dynamic and visually, stimulating just to keep people on board. But if I don't need someone to see the screen, I shouldn't be arguably making a video. And that's where podcasts come in, I think. So that sort of taught me. Just even my tutors were admitting that they weren't watching my videos. They were just listening to them. Affect. The next thing that I want to show you, actually, and this links to, the comments and things. When I've got a student, this is a blog post I've written on my Digital Learning with Digital Zones website. We'll provide these links if you're interested. The smile you can hear, I called this blog post because a student actually tweeted, "The first time I've received audio feedback for an assignment and what a difference it makes. I actually took notes of the points I want to work on for next time, and it's nice to be able to hear the smile in a marker's voice." So sort of transposing that feedback from a student about feedback over, podcasts do have an affective connection with people. They allow people to feel as much as they allow people to learn. So there's a cognitive and an affective level. And so that's I don't want to dwell on it too much, but that's one thing. I also want to go down a little bit in this blog post and read out a quotation from Robert McDougall. McDougall was writing about what he called PDMDs, personal digital media devices, personal digital music devices rather, like MP3 players. This is before podcasts really became a thing. And he wrote that PDMDs, which never took off as a term, enable the reconfiguration of perceptual space within individualized experiential contexts. They shape our environment. They change how we're actually engaging with our environment. When we put those headphones in our ears, we do shape our world in some ways. These devices afford users a relatively high resolution sound space that, when tuned properly, often replaces the perceiver both spatially and temporally. So this is kind of all highfalutin theory, and we can say it's just overworded and exaggerating. But I think there's something to that. In doing so, they have the capacity to fundamentally recast the nature of personal experience. Now, if that's even a quarter true, if that's a quarter accurate, then that's a really powerful thing. If someone can shift their own experience just through placing their earphones in their ears, being able to walk around but hear someone seemingly in real time, but not really. So, there's a lot of interesting kind of things that come out of that. We talk about virtual reality, augmented reality in terms of immersion mostly, but I think podcasts are immersive. So I didn't want to undersell that either. The next thing, I'm going to jump over to another blog post from this site, this is my very first blog on this particular site, which is sort of advice for teachers. I came up with the 3 C's, which is why it's around making media yourself and what the potential value of that is. One is credibility. If you're making something yourself, whether or not you're teaching social media students like me, there's a credibility to that. You are, putting yourself out there. I think it's as much about sharing yourself as it is about digital competencies, although they obviously play an important role. It's inherently creative. As I said, you've got that serendipitous element where you can find things that just happen that you can't plan for. And also connectivity. Those 2 things sort of lead to people connecting not only with their device, not only with the application they're listening to the podcast on, not only the text you're creating, but you. As I tell my students, I've got 350 students who are all making podcasts to submit by midnight tomorrow. So they're all very busy at the moment. Even if you are not talking about your own story, it's got your name on it, it's got your potentially got your picture on it, it's got some kind of logo. Even in an organizational context, you are sharing something of yourself as an individual and organization. So you're actually going to my last point there, another C word, community. You are building community, even if it's a specific target audience that you want to reach. Even within an organization, you are building community just by having the potential for people to be able to engage with the same kind of media, perhaps talk about it, drive conversations. I use these podcasts as optional learning resources that students, for the most part, my social media stories, they don't have to listen to, but it gives them something to talk about. It connects them because they've all got access to it. So that connectivity and community is sort of really important as well. So I will move on though to the how, because I think it's oftentimes I hear, even amongst teachers, how would I use a podcast? It can be exposition. It can be expository, where you are essentially giving a lecture, where you're providing information, instructions. I provide a lot of assessments kind of advice, as you saw before. That's really in place of a lecture. It's difficult, I suppose. I'd say the only downside is, and I don't think it's very likely you get much note-taking done in even a lecture theatre or a traditional recording. It's difficult to get note-taking done, and if I do a 10 to 12-minute podcast, I very much speak slower. I edit in pauses. I tell them at the start, this is going to be a boring podcast of exposition. I want you to take notes because it's for your assignment. Don't listen to it on the train or mowing the lawn and so on. So there are ways that you can do exposition, but I mostly use podcasts in different ways. Conversations. As I said before, I record conversations increasingly with students, but also researchers, industry practitioners of all kinds, many of whom are former students and graduates. So that's a really powerful way, and you've seen that in the podcast world, that more than one person talking is probably a more dynamic and engaging way. And going back to that issue of how long, expositional podcasts I'll usually keep to 10 to 12 minutes, but when I've got a conversation, I find it's very easy for me to get away with, if I can say it like that, a 20-minute podcast, even a 30-minute podcast, or a two-parter that's 25 minutes long, because it's conversational, because it's got multiple voices, and we like being part of conversations, even if we can't immediately contribute to them. And you can, unlike videos where you've a lot of talk about YouTube videos, 7 to 10 minutes maximum these days, depending on the kind of video. Unlike video, you can probably hold someone's attention because of their convenience and the way they don't have to be watched with a podcast for longer. So I think that's where a lot of the niche of podcasts are. With the long form content that video used to be, that isn't necessarily anymore. Events and panels, sometimes it's a struggle to get recording. I've tried lots of different things, recording quality, but I do make communication careers forums, and I've had a panel of 4 people that I then edit into a podcast later on. So there's lots of different kinds of organizational events that you can do. Audio recording of video content. I had a web series my first web series I called Talking Digital Media. I basically made those just 2 people, myself and one other person, sitting on screen. And then I turned them into podcasts after a little while. I just, posted the same material. Didn't do any editing. I didn't need to. So you can actually multi-platform certain content too. The most important thing is stories. Whether I'm, as you saw in that expositional podcast you listened to, I actually started intuitively with a story. I didn't even think of storytelling at the time. I just knew that I'd start to tell the story of this podcast in a meta way. But conversations with people, events with practitioners, stories are what people are engaging with, and that's why podcasts are a really emerging and dominant form at the moment, because of storytelling. And that's what really all media, for the most part, is all about, as particularly the engaging one. So I'll move over to the how now. And the first thing I'd say, while I'm still up on screen, I've been showing this a little bit. This is quite often the main and only thing that I've used to record podcasts. I do have, which I'm not able to use at the moment, a professional mic. This would not be very useful to take out. It would be less useful than my phone because it only takes audio in the front. I've used a Zoom, different to this kind of Zoom, before in terms of recording audio for podcasts. I have used Zoom itself. Actually, one of the best things to record podcasts with, especially in these current times, I have recorded podcast interviews interstate and overseas with what we're using right now, with Zoom, the different kind of Zoom. So this Zoom feature, even with the free account, you can have unlimited time for up to 2 people. You probably know that by now. And if you've captured anything, the video and audio quality is usually better than what I could capture on my phone if you've got decent mics being used. So I always use a backup, but there's really great recording features within a Zoom as well. So if you want to do a podcast with conversations, interviews with people, I'd use Zoom probably in preference than sitting in my office because of the ambient noise and the extra interruptions that can entail, knocking on other people's doors and so on. So that would be my advice, is to always probably more than, basically if I use these 2 devices, if I've got a good recording environment, there's not much difference. You're not really going to know the difference between my smartphone and a professional mic that could cost, and this is semi-pro, really professional ones of $800, $1,000. I don't even go near them because that's what YouTube vloggers really, need. There's really, the stuff you've got in your pocket is so good for making media. You can make a great podcast with your smartphone if you've got the right environment, and it's very easy to do that most of the time. So the other thing that I thought I'd mention about the recording and the how is, and I've skipped over planning, which I'll come back to, is performance. I'm performing right now. I'm speaking in a different kind of voice than when I'll go and obviously speak to my 3-month-old son later tonight when he wakes us up. We are always performing, and I've gotten better at that over time. More natural. I used to script everything for social media stories. Now I just speak to my phone, and I even start to edit in the audio recorder sometimes. I noticed that depending on the way in which, basically from the beginning of that podcast, I can hear the confidence in my voice over time. And I'd already been podcasting for a couple of years. So there's constant improvement. You never actually kind of, reach the peak. I guess there's no peak to reach ever with this kind of media. But, give things a go is the main thing. I have a funny activity, actually. I'll share this as one that I made. I often get my students to express how they feel about the idea of making a podcast with their peers by tweeting a GIF to the unit hashtag on Twitter. And they tweet pretty much 1 out of 100 says they don't mind the sound of their voice, but everyone hates the sound of their voice. I can't offer the best advice on how to get through that, but I promise you get used to it. I don't even remember whether I hated it anymore because I've done it for that long. So that's kind of another key thing that I'd say about performance. In terms of planning, though, I mentioned before, I used to script things. Organic delivery, especially in conversations, you've got editing as a backup. I think that, there's a lot to be said for that kind of thing as well. The thing that I've got on the screen here is actually something I'll provide the link to. Liz has it, and we'll provide it through an email later on, to a blog post that I've made with a lot of different content. Planning and recording your podcasts. I'll come to editing as well. There is some video material here in terms of 3 videos that unpack I'm expanding on, so probably some of the advice that is in these videos. But if you're interested in podcasting, I've got from planning to recording to editing being a blessing, and no, it's just a blessing. Editing is actually quite enjoyable when you get used to it as well. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then I'll come to music and how to find that. The music you heard in the podcast I gave you is Creative Commons license, perfectly free. As long as I credit it and link to it, I can use it in whatever way that I want. There's a whole world of media out there that a lot of my materials that I'll provide after this presentation will also help you with, and you can use it. And if you're not familiar with Creative Commons, is just an amazing millions and millions and millions of images and videos and music and sound effects. So, but I'll come back to that later on. The interviewing process, I won't say too much about this, but I'll also provide the link that I made. I made a 15-minute podcast on interviewing because I'd been interviewing quite a few people, I've developed a series of strategies for it, and some are common sense and some are probably only learnt by doing. So I think that that's kind of something that I won't touch on in detail here, but I'm happy to take questions on it later on. That's sort of another element of the recording process if you want further advice. But I'll move over to editing because I think that will be of interest to people in terms of what I used. I began editing my podcasts in a very silly way using my video editing program. It's more than fine to do that. It works. It actually works to use a video editor, and it took me a lot longer. It probably took me twice as long as it did when I started using Audacity, but I did begin in that. And I've heard when I've edited podcasts, whether they be students, particularly academic colleagues, students are usually probably even more confident in an interview with me than an academic colleague. I've edited so many podcasts and everyone says, you make me sound so good, because they're so nervous about how many ums they'll use. You can edit those out. You can, people are always kind of surprised, I think, and they do obviously all the hard work at what you can actually do with editing. And people, when they get in a conversation, a natural, organic conversation, are quite fluent. And you don't usually have to do too much editing, but if you really want to find detail, you can. I started using Audacity. Audacity is a free program. This is what it looks like here. Nothing's in it here, obviously, but I will say, the only thing I'll say, and there's more advice in my videos, I don't know what half the stuff in all these very detailed menus is. Look at all these different effects. I use probably fade in and fade out for my music, and I don't even know what wah wah and phaser mean. There's a way to get rid of some background noise that I've used every now and then, but really all I'm doing is cutting, cropping, moving, fading in and fading out. And that's essentially all that I do with Audacity. So it's pretty much a very user-friendly program that looks intimidating, but it's not. Some students, some Apple computers don't use Audacity. They've just become incompatible. Not all of them. GarageBand is another free program that's very accessible. And I've also seen a lot of students use Adobe Audition, which is part of the Creative Cloud that some of you may have access to. If you've learnt one audio editor, you can use any of them very easily. And Format Factory, I've also flagged, is a useful way to kind of change the format of file types. But I won't go into the fine-grained detail. I promise you, editing is fun. Takes a little bit longer than you think at the first, but it is actually a really great kind of part of the process. For music, I've got a couple of extra links to show you. I get most of my music with Creative Commons licenses from SoundCloud. The vast majority of the time, I type in something, I search, I narrow down the search on SoundCloud to Creative Commons licenses only, and then I find my music, and there's thousands of useful and really amazing tracks out there. Free Music Archive is another one. Some is royalty free, some has been shared with Creative Commons licenses. I've used that quite a bit, and a lot of students go there. Sound effects. I once made a podcast about my very first experience of VR gaming, and I went to Sound Bible and I grabbed some Creative Commons licensed, and all this is available in Creative Commons licensed sound effects. And I got some zombie sound effects and gunshots, and I made it sound like I was telling the story when I was in this creepy zombie-infested atmosphere of the experience of gaming. So there's that immersive. I'm happy to share that link if you like too, but the immersive effect of using sound effects and music in valuable ways. So that's sort of a little bit on music, but I think you'll be interested as well about hosting. Going back to SoundCloud here, SoundCloud is what I used from the beginning. It's free for 5 hours, 300 minutes you get for free. And it's now, I'm actually just realized today, thank you for the presentation, I realized I'm paying $150 a year when it's just been taken down to $7 US a month for SoundCloud. So you don't have to go to the top tier stuff. They've brought in some really accessible sort of lower tier levels, which give you unlimited music or unlimited podcasts that you can upload. That's essentially all you need, and it's quite inexpensive these days. Podbean is another one. I haven't got that opened up, but Podbean is one that I've used just for one little podcast or music video, music that I made for my 2-year-old nephew just to entertain him. I use the free version of that. Again, you've got 5 free hours, but you can do it for $9 a month if you don't want to use SoundCloud. Blurberry, which is what I use my social media stories podcast on initially, and I've frozen that now. That costs $12 US a month. But what I discovered after I did begin that is Anchor. Now, this is another podcast on digital learning that I've got. Anchor is a completely free site. It's very easy to set up. It's easier than all the other ones, and it automatically connects things over a period of a week or two to Google Podcasts, to Apple Podcasts, which is what they used to call iTunes, to Spotify, to the Android apps. There's a heap of Android apps. To there's a range of other kind of lesser well-known apps there as well. I can't even remember what they're all called. Overcast is one, but this is actually, it actually allows you to edit. I don't recommend you edit on Anchor, but you can upload your MP3s made with Audacity or whatever to this for free, and it puts it all over the world in that way. My recommendation would be to, if you're thinking of podcasting but not sure if you're just going to make a few and see how it goes, just use SoundCloud. Just do it to SoundCloud first, see if you're interested. Make 4 or 5 episodes before you start to do your monthly or twice a week or once fortnightly podcast, so that you've got a bit of a episode data bank, because things get busy. It's hard to keep up with stuff, and consistency is really important. So if you want a long podcast that you think you'll keep it going, maybe start with SoundCloud. Make sure that you like it. Make sure you've got your theme, your branding, whatever, and then go bigger. Go with Anchor later on. So go with the free option of SoundCloud. You get 5 hours. That's a lot of episodes. The other thing that I would say is, in that regard, don't put too much pressure on yourself. There are so many podcasts out there, especially with the true crime genre, that have a specific number of episodes. So you can say, let's just do a 5-episode series on this element of education or whatever, or 10 episodes, 10 conversations in 10 episodes. It doesn't have to be an ongoing podcast to have a lot of value and reshareability as well. So that raises, I did say branding there. I won't go into, logo, thumbnails, all these things, little things can matter, but audio branding. One example I've held back there is that I found that because my social media stories podcasts always start with, "Hi there, I'm Adam Brown, and you're listening to Social Media Stories." That's not how I sound to you right now, but I just naturally put this voice on, not quite as goofy as that, in my podcast, and there was an element of audio branding there, and that's only done by learning by doing. It wasn't intentional. I got more confident, and it's kind of a running joke in a sense, but it sounds different, it sounds professional, and that's how I started. You'll find different ways to brand your audio without even knowing it, and again, it's just learning by doing. If you're interested in sort of the next step, Anchor, iTunes, Spotify, all that stuff, you've got to think about how we're going to share it out there, how we're going to get there. And I thought I'd share, this is my vet, who I've got a very good connection with, a long history with. He and a friend put together, they've done weekly episodes for well over, I don't know what episode they're up to, about 60 or 70 now. They have an Instagram profile, they do videos together. There's lots of different ways that you can kind of expand your reach, but I've got Instagram profiles and Twitter profiles and Facebook pages. I'm not very good with keeping up with all that, and I'm not trying to go global. It doesn't have to go viral to have value. That's a really important thing. Even if just my students listen to it, I'm perfectly happy, because they're going to learn from it. That's really who I started it for. So that's another thing. You can go, you've got all these options, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, if you want to share it out. And you've probably, some of you got in your organizations have those, but there's other options to kind of broaden the reach there too. So the other thing is, I thought I'd mention, Great Australian Pods. They actually picked me up early on. They just found me by their search. This is a website that basically is a directory for all Australian podcasts. They call it Great Australian Pods. I think they list everything, and they've got quite a bit of traction. It's nice to, even if you launch a podcast, you can get it in there. And really, most importantly, you can go to the education section, and you can actually, outside the Apple or Android apps, find different podcasts that are available and see what other people are doing. It's obviously an emerging area. You can feel like, well, everyone's doing a teaching podcast, but no one's going to do a teaching podcast, an education-related podcast like you, because you've got different stories. Everything is new and everything is always influenced by what has come before. So there's ways that you can do your research, and you can see there's a heap of different podcasts there by 14 search pages as well. So the other advice that I give, I will leave to my links. I've got blogs there, but there are so many podcast channels. There are podcasts about making podcasts. There are web series out there. Obviously, you can do your research, but I wanted to really open an invitation. If any of you, after this question time, after today, want to have a one-on-one chat by phone or Zoom, I'm happy to catch up. You'll get my contact details, and we can tease out specific ideas and see what podcasting might have for you. But my most important piece of advice is to learn by doing. I'm still working things out, getting things so simple wrong all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I'll leave it there, Liz, and then I'll happily take questions. It's hard. I actually talked to one of the founders, the co-founders of Two Vets Talk Pets. They've got a great title. They were paying money right at the start. They've got a business. They've got two businesses. They work in different veterinary clinics where they are basically able to at least give out some merchandise or flag the fact they've got a podcast. They grind it away. I think the consistency is key. Giving engaging, useful content, having a bit of an audience on social media helps. But even then, maintaining an audience, a lot of people are going to come into a podcast and leave it. It's not like they'll necessarily follow you all along. I think the key is consistency, trying different things, but just adding value. I think that there's not really any difference between me making my YouTube videos in a web series, which never went viral. I did a web series on gamification. I do TikToks every now and then that I share with students. Again, don't go viral, although they're probably the most engaging things apparently that I do for students these days. But in the end, it's just looking to add value. I often tell my students, look to add value without expectation. Don't feel that you need 500 hits on your podcast with episode 1. I don't think anyone will get that unless they've got a TV series that they're launching a podcast supplementary to it. So look to add value without expectation. And that's the same advice or mantra that I have for when I post tweets, when I post videos, when I make anything. And the value will come. If you're looking to add value to your audience, then, and it's not for you, and it is, everything you do is for you as a subsidiary kind of thing, that's the way to success, if you think of your audience first. So you don't have to target a very specific audience, but obviously if you're in the educational sector, you've got a lot of people, especially at the moment, who are very interested in professional learning networks, building up networks online with social media, which I've blogged about. There's lots of educators out there in primary, secondary, much more so than university education, I'll happily admit, or unhappily admit, who are looking to upskill. And you give value, they will find you, and they will also acknowledge it too. So, bit of a vague answer, but probably the only one there is. It's never going to change. Add value. I'm not a very good interviewer because technically I should give my interviewees a list of questions before I do that. We have a theme sometimes. I have a one-word theme. But to be brutally honest, I walk into podcast interviews most of the time without a clear idea of what I'm going to ask. I'll have one or two, but I let the interviewee take me where they will. And that might end up being a 30-minute chat, which I then have to heavily edit, or it might make more work for me. But I find that giving them agency really helps. I've always had a purpose for other podcasts, I guess, that it's assignment advice, or it's, to engage, to really unpack without making a video a certain study topic. But it's very much a creative process. Then the serendipity, I can't emphasize enough. Sometimes it's like note-taking. You just open up the recorder of your phone and start talking. And that could turn into a podcast, as it did with my first one.